know any good ones?
No, I'm not going to tell a joke and get myself recorded.
Okay. Well, should we go into the serious stuff then?
Yeah,
All
let's
right.
go right into that.
Okay, well, let's talk some about how you see the Jesuits as thinking about Indians when they first went to them in 1970.
Okay, I think there are two ways of looking at how the Jesuits saw the Salish. They had preconceived notions, and then they had notions that they built on their experience once they'd met the Salish. And their notions before they met the Salish, the preconceived ones, were that the Salish were heathens. I mean, they referred to all Indians, not just Salish, but all Indians as heathens or savages, and so just the use of those terms show that they had a real superior attitude about this, that their culture was much better than the Salish. But they also had this idea that the Salish had no religion. And so this was part of their mission, was to save these heathen souls. So there's kind of three ideas that the Jesuits had about the Salish before they ever met them that really show that, they felt that the Salish were inferior to their, mainly to their religion, but also to their culture. Once they met the Salish, they thought that the Salish were nomads, and so they were needing to be civilized, because civilization meant that you were settled in one spot and that your subsistence was based on agriculture rather than hunting. Hunting was not considered okay. It was less than. It was uncivilized. And after they met them, they felt, it's kind of confusing, because they still didn't really grant that they had a religion, but they noticed, these practices and judged them to be evil and diabolical. And so it was like they had a unworthy or a not a true religion, like Catholicism was. Let's see. Oh, and the other part was they felt that the Salish didn't have good morals and didn't have good values, and a couple of reasons they based that idea on were the practice of gambling, practice of polygamy that the Salish did. And the Jesuits thought that, like for example in gambling, the stick game, Jesuits saw that as gambling, that, it was an evil thing to do. The Salish were willing to risk, all of their material wealth based on chance. But for the Salish, it was not attributed to chance. It was all tied in with their spirituality. If one team defeated another team, the victorious team, it was like an outward sign that they were being gifted, it tied back into that spiritual sense, that things were right with them spiritually, and that was how they were able to be victorious in this. So it was like an outward sign that things were going well, spiritually for the person or the team that won. It wasn't based on chance from the Salish point of view.
Okay. Okay, maybe you could talk some then about how the way that the Jesuits saw Indians when they went there was shaped by the mission that they went with, and what that mission was. What was the mission of the Jesuits?
Okay, well, when
We've already talked about that some. But
the unusual thing, though, about the missionization attempt made by the Jesuits is that the Jesuits were invited by the Salish to come to come to the Bitterroot Valley. And there were 4 different groups that went to St. Louis looking for the Jesuits. So, that raises all these questions. I mean, because that's unusual for a group of native people to seek their own demise. I mean, if you look at it over a long-term thing. But the Salish were inspired by probably 4 key things. They had a Salish prophet named Shining Shirt who told about the coming of the black robes, and that these black robes would have things to teach the Salish, that it would be good for the Salish to learn about them. And then in the early 1800s, around 1812, 1820, somewhere in that time span, a group of Iroquois from the eastern part of present United States, probably through the fur trade, were working their way west as the furs were being depleted further east. These Iroquois were moving further and further west, looking for new sources of furs. Finally came into, the western part of Montana and ended up, becoming part of the tribe and living with the Salish. They taught the Salish about the Jesuits and the Catholic prayers, and taught them some French. So the Salish were inspired by those 2 things. Out of hope, they were looking towards these 2 things, as a revelation of the prophecy and also of the discovery of the Iroquois teachings. But out of despair, they had faced a couple of really hard problems that made them look for something that could enhance their own spiritual base. Because for the Salish, and it's true for many other tribes, if not all, that the spiritual power for an individual or for a group really is the base for all other power. And so if something happens to shake that balance of power, whether it's economically or politically or socially, it's referred back to the spiritual source to gain power, to balance the power in these other areas. Well, there were 2 major things that were devastating this balance of power for the Salish. One was in the late 18th century, early 1800s, new diseases were coming in contact with the Salish, and they weren't able to deal with them or cope with them through their traditional medicines. So there were these epidemics that were wiping out whole groups of people, or decimating large numbers of people in bands and villages. And then the second major problem was the Blackfeet were traditional enemies of the Salish. The Salish got the horse. It migrated up from the southern United States, in from Mexico. And all of the tribes in the plateau were known by the Plains tribes and tribes to the east as having the best horses. And I mean, if you look in the Flathead Valley and the Bitterroot Valley, you can see why that was probably so. I mean, there's just a lot better source of feed. It's a milder climate than you have, in the plains. And so, in 1830, it was estimated that the Blackfeet had about 10 to 15 horses per lodge, whereas the Salish had about 50 horses per lodge. So this set up a whole cycle of the Blackfeet raiding the Salish and, getting their horses. Well, at the same time that this was happening, tribes to the east of the Blackfeet had the gun and were trying to prevent the Blackfeet from getting a hold of the gun. And they did pretty successfully until about 1790. And at that time, the Blackfeet had access to both, all of a sudden, to both the horse and the gun. And they had an advantage for those tribes on either side of them that only had the horse or only had the gun. So the Blackfeet, about 1790, had the horse and the gun, and the Salish didn't have the gun. This really upset the balance, so that the Blackfeet were able to not only raid the horses from the Salish, but to do it with a new power that they'd never had before. And so these two things pushed the Salish out of despair to question, their spiritual source.
Maybe just say these two things and say what they were again to re-summarize.
The disease and the...
But just say the whole thing.
Okay. The two things really upset the balance, or the two things, the new diseases that the Salish had not had before, and the upset and balance of power between the Salish and Blackfeet because of the Blackfeet having the gun, caused the Salish to, refer back to their source of power, which was their spiritual base, to look for solutions to these two major problems. And when they were really unable to resolve these problems from their spiritual source of power, that caused them, or that pushed them out of despair to look for a new source of spiritual power to enhance what was already, what already existed for them. So that's what they did, and they made 4 trips between 1830 and 1840 to St. Louis looking for the Jesuits. And in the I guess it would have been in the late 30s, I guess there were some Protestant missionaries that came through, and the Salish said, no, we're looking for the ones that wear the long black gowns, that use the wooden cross for their symbol, and that don't have wives. And you don't do those things, and those are the specific ones we're looking for. So the Jesuits took that as confirmation of their superiority to the Protestants. And, because, this wild tribe, this wild group of Indians, want us specifically. And it was a highly publicized event in the Eastern newspapers, that made the public, aware of what happened. That the Salish were asking for these Jesuits to come and establish a mission. Well, in 1841, that's just what happened. Father de Smet, and then along with Father Mengarini and Father Nicholas Point, went to the Bitterroot Valley and established a mission at St. Mary's. And let's see, what from there? Where should we go from there?
Maybe you could just, again, put in a nutshell how the Indians and the Jesuits were encountering each other with very different notions of what that encounter is about.
So, the Salish were really looking at this encounter the teachings that the Salish had to offer as a way to strengthen themselves so that they could cope with these new problems, but strengthen them through their spiritual source. And the Jesuits were coming in with this notion that they had a superior religion to offer and a superior way of life to offer. And very shortly after the Jesuits arrived, they became convinced that the only way to convert the Salish was to, for one, to get them from wandering around or running around or chasing the buffalo, as the terms that the Jesuits use, and to have them settle in one spot so that they could teach them Catholicism, but also to provide their needs for sustenance, have their culture based on agriculture, replace the hunting way of life with an agriculture basis of life. So the Jesuits really had in mind converting the Salish to Catholicism, but in order to do that, the Jesuits saw that they needed, or they believed that they needed to change the whole culture of the Salish.
So one thing that I'm thinking is just whereas for the Salish, it was really adding another spiritual power to their already existing beliefs, while the Jesuits thought of it as one replacing the other.
Yeah. Yeah, the Salish, I don't believe, I don't believe in, between 1830 and 1850, the Salish viewed Catholicism as anything else than something to enhance their culture, their religion, whereas the Jesuits viewed the missionization attempt as something that would totally replace and change, and civilize, in their own words, to civilize these heathens or these savages, that what the Salish were was not acceptable to the Jesuits. And they felt that the only way for it to become acceptable was to totally change what existed.
Is there anything more you want to say about spiritualities being part of a whole system, or do you feel like you've covered that already?
Let's see.
I think you've pretty well.
Yeah, I think so too. I think those were the things I was going to cover on that.
Okay.
That the one thing that I could add is that the Jesuits, so in order for the Jesuits to convert the Salish to Catholicism, the Jesuits saw that there was a need, or believed there was a need, to civilize the Salish, and this meant agriculture in place of hunting. So the whole way of life, or the whole culture of the Salish, was seen as an impediment or a block to civilization. And so, that was a block to conversion. So the Jesuit mission was really an attempt to eradicate native beliefs, native religion, but also to eradicate the whole way of life for the Salish people, their whole culture, and to replace it with the Jesuit variety of religion and culture.
Okay, that's great. Again, this is something you've touched on already, but maybe you could elaborate on it here, and that's this question about, that they believe that the Indians would immediately take up, the light of Christian God as it was presented to them, and abandon their beliefs. And many of them say that in fact is what happened. And maybe you could talk about that some, and remember about being clear about the different periods.
Okay. Well, I think one of the things that set it up is that since the 4 delegations that the Salish made to St. Louis in quest of the Jesuit missionaries, received such attention from the public, I think this really helped the Jesuits become convinced that, what they had to offer was the one true religion, and that since the Salish invited them, that the Salish knew that Catholicism was the one true religion. But I think from, what I said earlier...
No one will kill that fly.
Yeah, good. We get a... Okay. Oh, Tom, I forgot where I left off. It was on... Okay.
We were just talking about how the Jesuits thought that they would and did immediately become Christians and replace their native beliefs with that.
Okay.
And what in fact did happen.
Well, so the mission
Wait, start over. Don't curl that because it'll come out on the mic.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, so in 1840, when the mission at St. Mary's was established, and then between 1840 and about 1847, when the mission was closed, a whole series of different reactions were set up between the Salish and the Jesuits. Initially, the Jesuits, thought that, well, here's these prime candidates. They want us to come and teach them the true religion, and they've invited us to come and all this. And so, they did do things like, well, first of all, they tried to teach the main Catholic principles, but they, we have to stop. It's being goofy.
Come on, Gigi. Way up there, way up there. Bring it back.
Yeah. 6 or 7. It's 7. Nancy.
Nancy.
What's the score? 6.
Nancy. We got 6. 6. You got it. You got it.
We get to watch movies tonight. We'll see you later.
Bye, Pasty.
That's the music.
Yeah, bye, Lucindy. Oops.
I don't think the Salish saw the light of God in the same terms as the Jesuits did. I think the Jesuits, thought that not only did they have the one true religion, but this was the only way to God. This was the thing you spend your whole life preparing for, is, getting ready for, your place in heaven after you die. And the Salish were just much more practical about their religion. It was like, how can our religion be used to take care of our needs on a daily basis? Spirituality and religion, medicine were all sort of almost synonymous terms, and healing the sick, providing food, these were the concerns that spirituality was used for. The afterlife wasn't something that preoccupied Salish thought, and in at least one contemporary Salish person's words, he had said, Mitch Smallsalmon had said something similar to this. I'm not using his exact words, but the idea was that there wasn't a conflict between having both Salish religion and Catholic religion in your life, because Salish religion, or native religion, was for this life, and Catholic religion was for after you're dead. And that there have been other tribal members from other different tribes that have used that same idea to point out that there's a difference between the two religions. And so I think that the Salish were never intending to abandon their native religion or their culture. That Catholicism was seen as something that might be able to add strength or empower themselves in these extreme situations. And I really believe in the research that I've been doing, that period of time between 1840 and close to 1860, but definitely in the 1840s, that the Salish way of life, their culture, was still very strong, and that there was resistance to Catholicism, that it was never adopted wholesale. There were always, I think, differences between the way the Jesuits were envisioning Catholicism and that conversion process and the way the Salish envisioned it. Okay.
And did that change later?
Well, I think
We could just go into the question about when conversion and acculturation did become more successful and why.
Okay, I think that when the Salish came, or when the Jesuits came to the Salish, they, their stated goal was this conversion to Catholicism, but the impacts of their time there was really much greater than that. For example, Adrian Hecken, Father Hecken, established St. Ignatius Mission in Montana, where it is presently, in 1854. And the following year, he was at the treaty negotiations when Governor Stevens negotiated the Hellgate Treaty with the Salish. And it's like, the first group of Jesuits, Father de Smet and Mangrini and Point, those that came in 41, didn't realize, I think, the great changes that would follow them. I mean, they may have had some idea. I'm not sure really how much they knew about that. But by the time, the second group of Jesuits came, they were witnessing these changes. They were witnessing the great influx of white settlers into the Bitterroot Valley. In the 1840s, those first priests were noticing the decline of buffalo. In the 1850s, it was even clearly more, a decline, and throughout the 40s and 50s, the Jesuit priests were saying, it didn't appear then that this way of life could continue much longer. And they were looking at that as a benefit. It was mixed, though, because Father Point talks about it and says that he thought that it could be, a really bad thing that would happen to the Salish and the other tribes, but in terms of this whole civilization conversion, that it would be a benefit. It could be a benefit in the long run. And so all of these changes were coming about, and the Salish, I think, at a certain point saw that they weren't able to compete with the land, and the land left. They weren't able to compete with the white settlers for the land, especially in the Bitterroot. And so, increasingly as time went on, there was, by the late 1800s, there was less of a resistance to Catholicism, to acculturation, because it was an alternative that would enable them to survive. And so it was like, well, out of all these choices, which do you choose? And you choose survival, and at some costs, and those costs were a decline or a decrease in being able to live the traditional way of life. And so that meant increased acculturation, more people probably being converted. But I still, even in the late 1800s, I think that there was, take like from 1840, where there were examples of the Jesuits asking the different tribes people to, throw away their medicine bundles as a symbol that they were throwing away their traditional religion, and embracing Catholicism. And in fact, people did throw away their bundles and they were burned in mass fires. But I don't think I don't believe that what happened there is what the Jesuits thought happened. I think the Jesuits took that and said, okay, this means they're willing to give up their way of life, they're willing to give up their religion, and they are converted. I think that the Salish and other tribes in the 1840s were saying, okay, let's, go along with the Jesuits because we need their help, we need their spiritual help. And there were plenty of examples where the Jesuits allowed, it was a deception, they allowed the different tribes people to believe that things that were happening, for their benefit, either healing the sick or killing a bunch of game, was because of Catholicism. And so I think that, the Salish were at first testing it. That's the only way you can have faith, is if you test it and it proves itself true. So I think the Salish were open initially in the early 1840s. They were inviting Catholicism and they were saying, okay, we're willing to test this. But I think they did test it, and they found out that what they were being asked to sacrifice, their total way of life and their religion, was too much, too big of a sacrifice, and they weren't willing to do that. And that was the initial resistance to the conversion to Catholicism. And so, I think you find that that variation going throughout the rest of the 1800s, where there was periods of acceptance of Catholicism and other periods of resistance to Catholicism. So it wasn't one even flow, and it depended on, the surrounding circumstances. But I think by the early 1900s, by this time the Bitterroot Salish were removed to the Flathead Reservation, and farming was being done, and I do think that that was like the very late 1800s and the early 1900s marked sort of a shift in that balance of resistance and acceptance, and I think it became a shift towards acceptance of Catholicism and all that brought with it. And I'm not going to say that was the day when, the Salish threw away their moccasins and started wearing, boots or leather shoes. But that marked, in my mind, that marks the beginning of this tremendous change, where it was no longer feasible to live by hunting buffalo, which was the mainstay, and it was, hunting buffalo was still a feasible way of life until probably 1870, 1860, mid-1860s, somewhere, in the 1860s, and then, I think it became less and less feasible. It wasn't just, totally overnight either. But, by the time Charlot and his band moved to the Flathead Reservation in 83, I think it was, 1891. Okay, well, the first group of Salish that moved in 1883.
Arlie moved up in the 1870s.
Oh, okay.
I think actually he moved up like around 1876.
Okay, let me say then, when Arlie and the first group of Bitterroot Salish moved up to the Flathead Reservation in the 70s, 1870s, between that time and 1891, when Charlot and his group left and moved up to the Flathead Reservation, that was really the period of time that was clearly more evident that hunting the buffalo was no longer a feasible way of life. And I think that was one of the determining factors for Charlot and his eventual removal. I think he resisted moving as long as it was possible. And by 1891, he and his group were starving because there were no more buffalo to hunt. And there were so many white settlers in the Bitterroot Valley, it wasn't possible really to, take up an agrarian subsistence there either. But the farming, began on the Flathead Reservation in 1865 and then increasingly became a way of life until by, the late 1800s. I don't know how widespread to say it was, but it was more a way of life than hunting buffalo. I mean, hunting buffalo was pretty much non-existent.
We interviewed Father Dumbeck at the mission, and one thing that he said that I'd like you to respond to is he said that the Jesuits never wanted to ever force religion down the throats of Indians, that they simply offered their religion, and if they chose it willingly, then they did that. And if they chose their own beliefs, that was fine too.
Well, I think that's kind of a hard question to respond to, because I think you first of all have to narrow it down. What period of time are you talking about? But I mean, in general, I would say that the Jesuits, as compared to the Protestants, may have been more flexible in terms of tolerance of native culture. For example, Jesuits took the time to learn the Salish language, the different languages of the people they were working with, and you didn't always find that with the Protestant missionaries. Does that mean that they were willing to accept Salish religion if that's what the Salish chose? I don't think so. I think that they were still very adamant. I mean, because it's clear to me from the mindset, the way that those early Jesuits wrote, that they thought their way of life, their religion was superior. And because they were so zealously convinced, that their mission in life was to save these heathen souls, it was like that was God's work. God's work was to eradicate anything diabolical, and Salish religion and Salish culture was judged as being diabolical. So to do God's work meant to eradicate Salish religion, Salish culture.
Would you agree with the Jesuits that Salish religion and culture was diabolical?
No, not at all. And the one thing that I find really interesting that I hope I can incorporate into my research when I write about it is that, one example that I can use that might make it clear is, how there were so many parallels. I mean, I think there are parallels when you look at any religion, but there were parallels between native religions and Catholicism. Okay, the Salish, before they would go on a hunt, would ask for help from their special spirit helpers. And, this would give them power to, get the desired results in this hunt. Okay, when the Jesuits came along, they taught them prayers. So before the hunt, the Salish then would say these prayers taught to them by the Jesuits. And there was a painting that Father Nicholas Point had painted, getting ready before one of these hunts. And the inscription underneath the painting was, the Indian now says a prayer in addition to his usual harangue before going on the hunt. So it's like when when a Salish person or any other Indian person prayed to their spirit helper, it was a harangue. But if you prayed to the Christian God, it's a prayer. And it's like, what's the difference here? I don't get it. You know, it's like, to me, that's parallel. You know, prayer is the common, the universal, you know, religious thing to do. Whether it's to a spirit helper or a Christian God, you know, is the difference between Catholicism and Salish religion. I don't think that one is better than the other. I don't think one is superior to the other. I think that the Jesuit way of viewing their religion as the only way, the one true religion, is very ethnocentric. But I think that constitutes cultural invasion. When you determine that your way is superior to another group of people, and you go in, no matter what way, whether it's as a missionary or as a soldier, and you decide that you're going to eradicate someone else's religion or someone else's culture because you deem that yours is superior and theirs is inferior, that's invasion. And I think that's what the Jesuits were practicing in their missionization attempt, was cultural invasion.
Could you offer an alternative vision of Salish life to that portrayed by the Jesuits? In other words, the Jesuits, you could describe how they broadly characterized Flathead life and belief, and maybe you could also sketch something in broad terms that would differ from there.
No, I'm not sure I'm
For instance,
understanding.
they might talk about the Salish as heathens, you know, diabolical, haranguing, living
Yeah.
in some kind of grungy communal, you know, squalor, you know, a life of desperation and brutish, you know, lack of culture or anything else. Maybe you could paint these things side by side.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me. It's like, how can one group of people, you know, say, okay, these people are hunters, therefore that's not civilized. You know, I mean, it's like, okay, and so we plant for our food, you know, we plant seeds and harvest it, and that is civilized. You know, I mean, it's like, I think it would be really hard to try to come out the same way the second time as it does the first.
Okay.
Okay, I was just saying, you know, how can this society that's based on capitalism, you know, it's like this society, well, capitalism, you know, uses up the natural resources and, you know, it exploits people and it exploits the natural resources. And when it uses those up in this country, then it moves on to another country and exploits those natural resources and those people. And that is the bottom line of capitalism, continued growth. It's like, that's the whole reason for being for capitalism. And, you know, so continued growth to what point? And like you were saying, you know, well, either capitalism can stop or it can run its course, which means what, wiping out this planet eventually? Is that where continued growth will get us? But that is, you know, that mentality, or the mentality that supports that philosophy, is called civilization. And yet a society that existed for thousands of years without any permanent damage is considered uncivilized. And there are, you know, I mean, I look back, you know, at that civilization, and well, you know, in my mind, you know, I look back at that. It was a civilization in my mind. It's it's really incredible that one group of people can judge another group of people so harshly and, go in and assume dominance over a group of people based on that judgment. Like you can say, I guess, when you were asking about the different types of religion, or, how I would paint a picture of Salish religion as compared to the way the Jesuits painted that picture, I think, well, the two words come to my mind when I think of native religion, and those are respect and humility, because there's respect for, people and the earth, but it's like respect for the earth, where that whole idea is almost non-existent in today's culture. But then humility is that, you need to have humility in order to respect the earth and in order to respect other people. You have to be able to humble yourself to the point that you recognize that, I am not greater than that person or that tree or that mountain. We're all existing here together. If we play our cards right, we can all exist here together. But then in looking at some of the European religions and Catholicism, I'm thinking of specifically, but I'm not going to point the finger only at Catholicism, but I'll say, the other European religions, where it was like arrogance instead of humility, and dominance instead of respect, and that has been the motivation, or one of the forces that's been the basis of the religion, but also the capitalistic society. It's like dominance and arrogance have really gotten things out of balance.
Okay. I'm trying to think, did we pretty much cover when conversion and acculturation attempts became successful? We pretty much covered that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So maybe you could just go on from there and talk about what the cultural impact of allotment and opening the reservation to whites was.
That's really the hard one for me to talk about, because that's way out of my, the time period that I'm
research.
looking at.
Okay, that's fine.
The only thing that I've seen is that when the second treaty was being negotiated, I guess it was a treaty, wasn't it? The second that made, it was written much earlier, but it was asking for the removal of the Bitterroot Salish to the Flathead. But it happened, several years before even Arlee and that first group moved to the Flathead. But when that was being negotiated, what I was reading about that was that, God, I'm not even sure if that was what it was. Anyway, I was reading that there was some negotiations, I'm not sure if it's this treaty or not, but the Indian leaders who were present were saying, we don't want to have our lands divided up. And there had been rumor, that the lands would be divided up and allotted to individuals, and they were saying, no, we don't want that. But, here I don't even have the date for that or anything. But I think, just generally, the whole idea of allotment was really contrary to tribal existence. And so, I don't know, by 1910, if things were then already, changed enough from all of these preceding events that it had a really large impact. Well, I mean, it definitely did on the Flathead Reservation. It was a way to basically take away Indian lands. I mean, that's what's happened with allotment on the other reservations too. But in terms of, the questions we were talking about of the cultural and the religious impact, I'm not sure that in itself allotment really, had that sudden impact. I don't think it did. I think, that allotment's impact was devastating, but it was over time, as Indian people lost their allotments, as more and more non-Indians moved onto the reservation. I mean, the effects of the Allotment Act can be seen on the Flathead Reservation today, where, the tribe has a minimum percentage of land holdings, and non-Indians are the majority on our reservation. But, like I say, in terms of 1910, I'm not sure if you would see a sudden impact, like there was allotment and what happened. Did people resist immediately? I don't think so. I don't think people were really knowing, what to do about it. I mean, I think initially, before allotment happened on the Flathead Reservation, people were saying, in the late 1800s, I think it was in 1880s that I was reading about this, that, the different tribal leaders were saying, we don't want our lands broken up. But if, 40 years later, 30 to 40 years later, I don't know, if that view had changed or not. So allotment's a hard one, because you can look at what's happened today and say, well, it was really devastating. It was very anti-tribal. It was devastating, but at the time it might have been harder to see that.
Yeah, that'll work great, because we have comments of elders that are basically saying they didn't understand those.
Okay.